Good evening. We are so glad that you could join us tonight for what we believe will be a fascinating program brought to you by the Reimagining America Project. I'm Cheryl Spainhour, co-chair of RAP's Environmental Justice Committee. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's program, The Human Cost of Hog Waste. I would like to introduce our panelist and Reverend Rodney Sadler, tonight's moderator. Lendora Farland, who had planned to be a panelist this evening, is a Duplin County resident who was a witness at trial and personally experienced their family's loss of use and enjoyment of their property. Unfortunately, she is unable to join us tonight due to a family matter, and we ask that you keep Lendora and her family in your prayers and thoughts. Salisbury law firm Wallace and Graham founding partner Mona Wallace and her team have successfully sued and recovered from many corporate wrongdoers involving environmental toxins such as coal ash, asbestos, chemicals, and most recently hog waste. From 2013 to 2020, Mona Lisa and her litigation team represented Eastern North Carolina families in one of the largest environmental claims in state history, bringing private nuisance lawsuits against the hog production component of behemoth multinational Smithfield Foods. The lawsuits allege that the antiquated lagoon and spray method of hog waste disposal was interfering with clients' use and enjoyment of their homes and lands, and all 5 of the federal juries agreed. Corban Addison is the internationally best-selling author of 4 novels, and Wasteland is his first work of nonfiction. He is also an attorney, activist, and world traveler. He and his family reside in Virginia. Wastelands is a riveting account of the story of a legal battle and the lives of the people who fought and won. I want to read you a short excerpt from Corban's book that summarizes the significance of this story. Mona was at a crossroads toward the beginning of this lawsuit. Corban writes, Mona can't get the plaintiffs out of her head. Their stories are a part of her now. What is the price of clean air? What is the value of uncontaminated water? What is the dollar equivalent of human dignity, of a woman's claim to the land her great-grandfather acquired for toiling on it as a slave? Some things are worth the fight, no matter the reward. And now it's my privilege to introduce our moderator, Reverend Dr. Rodney S. Sadler, Jr. He is a graduate of Howard University undergraduate program and the School of Divinity. He earned a PhD from Duke University in Hebrew Bible and Biblical Archaeology with minors in New Testament and Cultural Anthropology, a faith-based justice advocate concerned with numerous social issues. Dr. Sadler is the Associate Professor of Bible and the Director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation at Union Presbyterian Seminary on the Charlotte campus, and he is the co-chair of the Reimagining America Project. Dr. Sadler will give our opening prayer, then Mona will begin our program with a photo slideshow about hog waste, followed by Corban's story about activist and plaintiff Elsie Herring, before we move into a conversation with Mona and Corban, moderated by Rodney. We will hold a Q&A at the end of our program, so please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A. Rodney?
Thank you so very much, Cheryl. It's indeed an honor to be with you all tonight. I want to say thank you to Mona and thank you to Corban for being with us. You are expert witnesses tonight. You all will give us some insight into what's actually going on with these poor farmers, these poor rural communities in Eastern North Carolina. But before we do anything, let's look to the Lord. Holy One, it's once again that we come before you with thanksgiving in our hearts. We're grateful for this another opportunity to delve into this world and to see the way that we have treated each other. Lord, we know that we have often treated those with darker skins as though they were lesser peoples and taken their rights away, their value away, their dignity away. Lord, we're grateful this evening for Mona and the work that she has done to restore some dignity. We're thankful for Corban and the work that he has done to record the stories of those who have been impacted in such a significant way. And we want to ask that you would be with us throughout this program, help us to understand the significance of it and why it is that we need to do something that your truth might come, your justice would be done for all of your children made in your image. We call on you by many names, but in all of them we remain grateful to you and ask that you use us. Amen. Mona, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having us tonight and those really kind words. We very, very much appreciate it. It's very difficult to explain and to comprehend the real harms and the hazards of hog waste unless you understand and appreciate the way that the waste is being disposed of. In order to explain that to you a little bit better, I'd like to quickly show you some slides of the lagoon and spray system. What we're showing you are some of the illustrations that we used in some of our federal 5 trials to educate our jurors. So first, you really need to understand what a CAFO is, a concentrated animal feeding operation. And today, most of the hogs in this country that are commercially being raised and sold are being raised in these concentrated animal feeding operations. So Linda, if you'll help me with the slides. I'm going to show you inside an industrial hog operation. The hogs stand on concrete floors. They never go outside and breathe the clean air. They never touch the ground. They never see the dirt. And you can see how many are in there. And they get larger and larger. In just 5 months, they can grow to be as high and weighty as 300 pounds. Linda, the next one, please. As she's pulling that up, the way that the waste is disposed of it, you can see that the hogs are standing on wooden slats. The waste goes through those wooden slats and it goes down into a pipe and it comes out in literally an open air hole. Literally, it looks like a football field, but there's holes dug into the earth. Sometimes they're called lagoons. Sometimes they're lined, sometimes they're not lined. Often they're in floodplains, and we know Eastern North Carolina is sandy soil. You have a lot of hurricanes. So the waste just simply, it goes into these open air lagoons. It's not treated, and then it is sprayed in the air. And Linda, I don't know if you can get the photos to work. And if you can, I can just go ahead and explain it. And I will explain that this did work before we start. But you can see you have all the hogs. The waste goes down in these open, it looks like football fields. There they are. See, they're coming up. And it's sprayed into the air. And where it is sprayed is in the communities. And these communities, especially in Eastern North Carolina, you can see, Linda, I have one here. This was one on the left of a number of buildings. They all have generally about 1,224 hogs in them. So if you just had 3 buildings, Dr. Sadler, you would have about 6,000 hogs. When you have that many buildings and the hogs, when they're just fed to grow and add more and more weight. So hogs excrete about 5 times the human waste of a human. So you can imagine a community primarily of color in sandy soil, the waste going in virtually open pits or lagoons, sprayed in the air or evaporating in the air. And there's over 2,000 of these lagoons in Eastern North Carolina. And again, a number of them are in the areas of the communities. So when the spray goes into the air, the wind carries it and it goes literally onto the properties and in the air for the children to breathe, for the other animals to breathe, and for the people to breathe. And when you have hogs and you have all of this waste, you have massive amounts of gases dangerous, deadly gases. For our trials, we hired a National Geographic photographer, and we were virtually able to capture videos of the gases escaping out of the air. And Linda, you did just pull up kind of, you can see the open air, the lagoons that are just holes dug into the earth. And you can see some of that lagoon on the left is pink, some of it is black. And you can imagine what that black is that you're seeing. It's of course the waste that has come up to the surface. We were able, for one of the first times in history, to get inside these buildings, these CAFOs that had the thousands of animals. And we were able to show the juries the condition of the hogs. And especially in our third trial, I mean, you could barely see the eyes of the poor animals, of the hogs, because they were so covered in the waste. In addition to it being sprayed in the air, the gas escapes as I described it. But you have to get the hogs in and out of these communities. And usually or often the roads are adjacent or very near the people's homes. So we had pictures of trucks coming and going all night long with their lights shining into our clients' homes. You know, the sound of the pigs squealing when they're trying to sleep. So the hogs and the trucks were a big part of our trials. The fact that, look what this is doing to the environment, the health hazards, the gases result in the death of a lot of the hogs themselves that are in these very confined spaces inside the buildings. And at least through our trials, the way that the dead hogs were maintained is there would be a massive box, usually sitting somewhere close to these buildings or CAFOs. I refer to them as factories. And they would throw in the open air these dead hogs. And of course, the hogs would decay. And when they decayed, you would have, here's a picture, thank you, Linda, of the spraying in the air. You can see these big, massive sprayers. Linda, if you have any more, just pull them up. There it is. You can see what I just described. You see the communities again, and you see the sprayers. You can imagine it's going straight into and on their homes. We actually tested their homes, and we did find, interestingly, hog waste or feces, the DNA marker for it, on the outside of the homes. And that came into evidence as well. See how close, as I mentioned, the roads are? And those roads are where the trucks and the tractors come and go with the dead hogs. And Linda, I don't know, here's one of our clients, Jimmy Jacobs, and I'd love you to hear, if you can, what he said about
that's just something I love to do. I grows tomatoes, okra, most of all collard. It'll be along about Thanksgiving, they'll be ready. In that field right there. It sprays that field right there. And then when the wind's blowing, it just blows that fog right over here. Oh, that's kind of rough. Sometimes I have to quit. The smell be so strong. The wind be blowing this way. That fog, that mixture fog coming off of it, blows over here. Gets all on my glasses. I just quit and go inside until they get finished.
Mr. Jacobs was in our third trial, and he was one of our lead plaintiffs. And that tractor, you can see how close the road is, and the spraying is I talked about coming over into his garden. And the very sad thing, one of the things that made me so invested in this case is that the clients never know when that the odor will come, or the buzzards that or come to their yards actually because of all the dead boxes or the flies. So the juries did find, all 60 of them, that these practices, having this open air lagoon and spraying it in the air, that it did unreasonably and unnecessarily interfere with their use and their enjoyment of their own properties. So it was a case really of environmental injustice. And we were just happy that the jurors and these people, their stories were really heard and they were told.
So I think I'm just going to step in here and take Lendora's place. Lendora was someone that I was fortunate to get to know quite a lot in the process of researching my book, Wastelands. But I actually wanted to tell the story of Elsie Herring, another plaintiff who I call in the book the Sojourner Truth of the plaintiffs group. She was probably the luminary of luminaries, had been around fighting this fight for 30 years. I'm going to show you a picture here of Elsie, and there you go. So Elsie, this little house was built in 1921 by her father. She almost lived, or may have just lived, to see its centennial in 2021. She unfortunately passed away very early that year. But this little home she was born in, she was the 15th of 15 children, the youngest, and her mother, Beulah, had lived in this home her entire life. Beulah lived to the age of 99. Elsie, like many of her siblings, did not find useful employment after growing up young and Black in the 1950s and 60s in the South. So she followed the Great Migration north and actually landed in Brooklyn with a number of siblings. And she would walk across the Brooklyn Bridge every day to work at a number of financial institutions in Lower Manhattan. I mean, it's pretty amazing. A Black woman with a high school education was able to make her way on Wall Street in the 1960s. And she was a great worker. She was super smart. She knew exactly how to get a job done. They rewarded her for it. And she was able, by the early 1990s, to build up enough of a nest egg to retire. And she came back home to Duplin County, to this house where her mother was living. Beulah, by that point, was in her 90s. And Beulah had been caring for Elsie's older brother, Jesse. Jesse was the 14th of 15, and he had Down syndrome. So Beulah had been taking care of Jesse his entire life. And in her 90s, she no longer could. So Elsie came home in 1993 in order to care for Beulah and Jesse. And what she didn't realize is the world had changed. I mean, the world that she grew up in was a rural world in which there were hogs all around. Everybody had, a hog pen in the backyard. It was, their breakfast bacon. It was their holiday ham. Nobody cared if you had hogs. And so when she learned that the neighbor next door had built a hog farm, she didn't think anything of it. She didn't realize that the hog farm had thousands of hogs crammed into these sheds that never, as Mona said, never see the sunlight, never touch the dirt, and are excreting, 5 times the waste of a human being. And that's being slushed out into a giant open air cesspool. She had no idea about any of this until one day, the hog farmer, who ironically was related to her grandfather, Emmanuel, was actually born to a slave woman during the time of slavery, before emancipation. And Emmanuel's father was white, the planter. And so the hog farmer next door was actually a neighbor, was part of the Herring family on the white side of the line. He brought out one of those giant Jurassic-sized spray guns, the ones that Mona showed. And Elsie and her mother and brother were out on the porch. I mean, this is, it's summertime, very hot down east. They don't have any air conditioning. The windows are open. They're out on the porch to catch the breeze. And this hog farmer goes away, and all of a sudden they hear and then see this giant rooster tail of spray go up into the air. And initially it's just kind of like curiosity. I mean, it doesn't look like water. I mean, it's liquid clearly, but it's this muddy pink color that's just gross. And then of course, what happened? I mean, the breeze caught it and brought it just a few feet. I mean, it was a couple dozen feet away onto their property. It got, I mean, this is the most putrescent scent that you can imagine. I mean, it got in their clothes, it got in their lungs. I mean, it started burning their noses. It got made their eyes water. All three of them ran inside, hot summer day, closing all the windows, closing the door, trying to escape the spray. Can't escape it. It's on them. It's in them. It's what Elsie would later describe many times in telling the story as the live scent of hog, which I think is like the most perfect way to describe it. And then, inside this newly formed prison of her ancestral home, she heard something, and it was on the roof. She looked up and realized that she was hearing the sound of droplets falling upon her mother's roof like rain. Now, Elsie had been able to make her way in the white man's world, and so she did not take this sitting down. She got on the phone. She started writing letters. She called the local sheriff in Duplin County, said, "Help me." Turns out he was a hog farmer. He didn't want to help. She reached out to the local soil and water people, and they basically, more or less do the industry's bidding. And so they didn't help. She reached out to state level officials, regulators, the governor's office, the attorney general. Nobody wanted to help until one day, a new state representative in Duplin County in 1994, Cindy Watson, decided to come out and see what was going on. Cindy had just taken office during the she was swept into office as a Republican in the Gingrich Revolution of 94, but in the state house. And yet, even though she was very pro-business, she had a big heart for all of her constituents. She came out and stood on the property line looking at the spray gun and listened to Elsie tell her story. And the hog farmer came out and had some words, and those words turned super racist and nasty right in front of the representative. Cindy was taken aback, couldn't believe it, and said, "Look, I'm not here to take away your job. I'm here to help my constituents, both you and Ms. Herring. Let me see what I can do." She went away to the state house and quickly found that it didn't matter that she was white and a state representative. Nobody wanted to listen. Nobody wanted to listen. In fact, at one point, the industry's top lobbyist took her aside and quietly whispered, "Representative Watson, we all know what the problem is. We've known it for a long time, but that industry pays me a lot of money to make sure that absolutely nothing happens." So nothing, in fact, happened until 1997, when turned out the industry, its expansion to, by this point, almost 2,000 of these large-scale industrial hog farms started to encroach on land that the good old boys in the state house cared about, namely the iconic golf resort Pinehurst. They were going to put a hog farm down the road from Pinehurst. It was at that point that the state representative said no, and suddenly the governor's on the phone with Cindy Watson saying, "Hey, would be happy to put a moratorium on these hog farms." Unfortunately, the moratorium which passed only pertained to future hog farms. It did not help Elsie Herring, didn't help any of the other neighbors. And they continued to agitate with the help of some amazing local activists. Elsie would tell her story to anybody who came. She was on the TV. She was in the state house testifying. She did everything she could. But it really wasn't until Mona Wallace and her firm decided to take this case in 2013 that Elsie had real hope that change could happen. She was in the courtroom as much as she could be. Her case was not one of the ones that was tried, but she was very much, sort of spiritual leader of the plaintiffs group. And she was able to see justice served. It was one of the last things that she saw in this life, in fact, was not only the jury verdicts, but the appeals court upholding the jury verdicts. And a judge we totally thought, and I think Mona will play this later on, we totally expected he was going to rule against the plaintiffs, actually being the one who ruled most profoundly in Elsie's favor and in favor of all of her other plaintiffs. So, I truly wish that you could have met her, that you could have seen her. She was quite a woman, a hero of mine. And I was privileged to be able to tell some of her story in Wastelands.
Thank you so very much, Corban, and thank you so very much, Mona. I just want to say before we get started, I'm so very pleased of the work that you've been able to do and that you have given voice to a group of people who otherwise would never have been heard. You've given the opportunity not just to have their stories told, but to make sure that they had a victory. May not be all the victory that they need, but you've been able to at least get them started on that. Let me just start off with a simple question. What was the racial makeup of the majority of the plaintiffs? Were most of the people that you were dealing with as plaintiffs and as the characters in your story, Corban, were they mostly Black and brown folk?
Nona?
Oh, no. So we filed 26 lawsuits for 26 communities in 5 counties. Like in Duplin County, you have 35 hogs per person, 2 million hogs, just hogs everywhere. Of our 525 plaintiffs in the 26 communities, I had less than maybe 5 that were not people of color. So it was so obvious. Interestingly, we never mentioned the word race, racial injustice in our 5 federal trials, but it was beyond obvious. There would be, if you walked into those federal courthouses in that courtroom, you would see Mona Wallace, Mike Keskey, and our very small group of lawyers and advocates on one side with a few people of color and environmentalists, and then on the other, you would see virtually powerful, industrial, almost all no minorities on the other side. So I think it was obvious to the juries without us having to say that. I want to say one thing interesting. In our second trial, we challenged something that Blacks, a particular person of color, an African-American, was being excluded unreasonably from the jury. It's called the Batson challenge. And I'd rarely ever seen that done, but the court did seat that particular juror. So I think the race issue was very obvious, and that the fact that these people were primarily minorities in communities, by the way, sir, that had their churches right there, and in some communities, their burial grounds. I do want to say one thing. I was thinking about it when Corban was talking. Our federal lawsuits were not against the farmers. We were very sympathetic to them throughout and still are. We only sued, in our case, Murphy, Brown, or Smithville, because they were Smithville's hogs, Smithville's rules, Smithville's procedures. And, you know, the big company, they dictate how these hogs are raised using this lagoon and spray system that's obviously outdated and should have been discarded decades ago.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for wrestling with that. Corban, I just love to hear. So the people that you're interviewing, did it give you a different sense of their story to realize that the majority of people that you're dealing with in this narrative are minoritized people? How does that shape the way that you tell their story?
Yeah, I mean, I was privileged to sit in on the first day of the 5th federal trial, and I was not only captivated by Mike Keskey's performance in front of the jury, and by Mona's winsomeness and her team's unique cohesion. I mean, they felt like a family, and in fact, some of them were family. But I also sat in the lunchroom and got to talk to some of the plaintiffs, including Lendora Farland, who was supposed to be here today. And Lendora is a bubbly personality, magnetic. I mean, immediately you love her. And just sitting next to her and hearing her family story, it immediately struck me. I mean, I had spoken to Mona previously, but it was one thing to speak to Mona, in the abstract, another to sit next to Lendora and listen to it personally. I realized this really was a civil rights story. It was kind of an untold civil rights story. And that captivated me. I mean, all of my books have been about issues of injustice and human rights around the world. And here was an issue of injustice, a civil rights story that was literally lurking in my backyard without me having any idea about it. So, I mean, that it captured my heart out of the gate. I really wanted to tell this story, but I also knew, as being white, coming from a middle class background, that it was going to require me to spend a lot of time down east, and really, as I do with all of my stories, go to learn, go with open hands, a desire to embody, the stories that people share, and to honor them. And so it really was such a privilege to get to know these folks, to be able to carry their stories into the page. And then to see, and a number of them were able to come to the launch event that we had in Raleigh. And, I got to see, Lendora and a couple of others there. And it was just beautiful to be able to kind of celebrate the release of the story with the folks who were so important in bringing it to life.
Well, that's absolutely amazing, and I'm grateful that you were able to do that, to bring the story to light, and just calling it a civil rights story that's untold. Do you think this would have happened had the people in the area been largely white and well-to-do? Would this situation have happened, Mona?
Absolutely not. In fact, these people had been trying for years, decades, to get someone to represent them, and it was very difficult for us, and we were 4 hours away. We had, a lot of intimidation. The clients were intimidated. That went on, but we had the 5 federal trials, and the jurors did rule for us on it being unreasonable, interference with the use and enjoyment of their property. Smithville then appealed to the federal court, the appellate court in Richmond, Virginia, where, by the way, I sat beside Elsie Herring Pride. It was just a few of us there. Corban was there. He's an incredible writer. And so I encourage everyone to read the book. But there were 2 or 3 federal judges. They were, in my opinion, very conservative. But you asked the question, would it have happened if the circumstances had been different? And there is a 3-minute clip that I would like to play, because while we did not win all of the appeal, we won on most of the issues, but the senior federal judge, Judge Harvey Wilkinson, when Smithville's lawyer was arguing, he interrupted him, and he spoke on the very question you just asked. So Linda, see if you can play it. By the way, now we're seeing the pictures. Go ahead.
And I'll just speak in a general matter, what troubled me, and that when you look at the complaint and you look at the trial, the hog farming here, it certainly provides many jobs in Eastern North Carolina, and I understand that, and it's very important to the economy of the eastern part of the state, and that's surely true, and it is important, not only that, but to our national food supply. But it's harmful to the people who live nearby. You look at the amicus briefs, look at the complaint, it's got to be environmentally harmful to the waterways and seeping into the water. Nobody wants another Flint, Michigan tragedy down the road. And this can't be good for children's respiratory systems. Just these odors, talking about wheezing and headaches and things like that. And the inhumanity to the animals and the fatality rate among the hogs, I suppose they're just animals, and maybe some people think they're ugly and treat them the way we want. But I just kept reading this case, and I'm thinking to myself, if this were my property, I would be outraged at some of these conditions that were allowed to persist. And I think, our less fortunate fellow citizens, they have property rights too. And many of the homes surrounding an operation of this sort. They don't go for a high price. For the people that live in them, you know, they have a right to good health. They have a right to their enjoyment of their property.
If I could respond to two things.
And I was, and I don't know, I thought if this were some McMansions surrounding these hog farming operations, if these were the houses of the affluent, wouldn't those conditions, if these were more politically powerful, wouldn't those conditions have been cleared up sooner rather than later? And that is my problem.
That is remarkable testimony, and I guess you made the point for you, Mona. That really did.
That was
yeah.
the federal judge, one of the most highly respected conservative in this country.
Mhm.
And as he said that our clients, they wanted to be believed, and they wanted to be heard, and they wanted the conditions to change. They've never been opposed to the capos remaining where they are, and they certainly didn't want to affect their friends or jobs or anything like that. But they wanted to be able simply to use and enjoy their property. And I have children and grandchildren like the rest of us do. So that's really why our heart and soul is so much in this case and representing them. And Corban, I think you did capture that in your story.
Yeah, it was a remarkable moment. I mean, I was sitting there behind Mona and Elsie, and I mean, right before the judges came on, Mike Keskey made a wise crack. He said, I feel like one of those hogs going into the slaughterhouse. And then, you know, Judge Wilkinson stopped everything, you know, blew the barn doors off, and left it, frankly, all of us in tears. I mean, it was really a striking moment. You know, justice doesn't always come to the courthouse, but it did that day.
Amen. I'm so grateful that you were able to make the compelling argument that you did, to bring the people with you, to share those stories and those slides that really made it clear. And then Corban, to bring this even further in this wonderful text, Wastelands, which I encourage you all to go out and get a copy today. You will not regret that, and you will find that he's not just a brilliant lawyer in his background, but also a wonderful storyteller. The way that you tell technical details in a way that's engaging is quite remarkable. I've got a question from one of our audience members. Reverend Janet Garner Mullins asked, what happened to the community since the litigations, and have the plaintiffs been awarded financially for all their pain and suffering? Let me start with you, Corban, on that, and then go to Mona.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just speak to the communities. You know, what's kind of a remarkable fallout of the 5 federal trials in which the juries found that those farms were a nuisance. As Mona pointed out, the plaintiffs, the neighbors never asked for those farms to be shut down, for the pigs to be taken away. But Smithfield decided all on its own to depopulate those farms. So in Lendora's case, for instance, you know, there were some photos that show this. You know, she and her family lived right. I mean, I should say that a hog farm was built right on top of their house. I mean, it just was, you know, it's the fence, the property line. There's no barrier whatsoever. Stones throw away, you know, these barns, this cesspool. What's remarkable is that after the jury found in favor of her family, Smithfield took all the hogs away. So with them went their waste. And in fact, then it turns out, and I've only heard this as a story since then, and I've not confirmed it, but my understanding is that the hog farmer next door has basically torn down the barns and gotten rid of everything. So it's now just a freestanding field. I guess he may have done that for the tax benefit, because he was being taxed on a useless hog operation. But regardless, for Lendora and her family, I mean, the property has been returned in some sense to its pre-hog farm state, back to the way it was when she was a kid in the 1970s. That's a pretty lovely outcome, though. Again, that wasn't what they were asking for. They were just asking for the industry to pay the money, you know, some portion of their profits, to actually modernize and civilize their waste distribution. Industry is not willing to do that, but they were willing to take away, the hogs. So, I heard from a number of other neighbors in other communities where the trials went forward. They too have enjoyed having the hogs gone. But I'll leave Mona to, Mona, you can talk about the changes that were made and came out in the trials that Smithfield really did under pressure to make the conditions a little better.
Well, by the time we won the first two verdicts and very significant verdicts, actually, I think the first three on were. But at the third trial, all of a sudden, the industry started talking about change. The witnesses on the stand started talking about changes that they had intended to make after the verdicts and after a settlement, which is confidential, was announced. The press reported on changes being made, changes such as not spraying the waste as high in the air, but still using, in most cases, the spray guns or similar equipment. The trucks, because we had made such a big deal about the trucks running 24 hours a day, a lot of our clients reported they weren't running, and the press reported as often, I believe, or as 24 hours a day. And it was reported that they are moving to the like a refrigerated unit instead of having just dead boxes in the middle of the community. As a result of our trials, we had taken photos of dead boxes. They were moved back, but the basic problem is the lagoon and spray system. It continues. Only the cases that were taken to trial, only those people, they were shut down and the hogs taken out, and we never asked for that. But for the most part, it's not been enough change, and it will never be satisfactory until they get rid of digging an open hole in the earth, lined or unlined, allowing millions and millions of gallons of waste to just simply stay there, evaporate in the air, spray it. And of course, that is the cheapest, most outdated way to manage waste. You have human waste managed where it's treated. In one of our cases, we had human waste treated perfectly because there's so many rules and regulations on that. But for the most part, there are virtually no regulations in our state sadly allows the spray and lagoon system to continue.
That was, I remember from your conversation before that the company that partners with Smithfield from China has better practices in their own country than they allow for here in the U.S. Is that, do I remember that correctly?
Corban has studied that. Corban, I'm turning that one over to you.
Yeah, I mean, look, in China, they actually don't allow the lagoon and spray field system. So there was a story in Rolling Stone, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, in which the title was, is China using North Carolina like the developing world? Which is the sort of reversal of fortunes that you can't imagine until you see it. I mean, in reality, they are. It's cheaper for them to raise the hogs in North Carolina than it is to raise the hogs in China, and then to ship the meat back. In fact, there was a story not long ago, of this incredible new way of raising and then slaughtering hogs. That it's this giant. I think it was like a 12-story building, like the skyscraper of pork. Which was outfitted with all this technology to keep the hogs healthy and clean, and to raise them as quickly as possible, and obviously to dispose of the waste in a way that doesn't just go out into the rivers and streams or be sprayed out into the air. I mean, if China can do it, I mean, for crying out loud, we can do it. And in fact, as Mona and her team were able to show at trial, it would cost, a few $100 million, to this multi-billion-dollar company to actually replace these legacy lagoon and spray field systems with a more civilized way of managing their waste. And they just won't do it. What they will do is they realized not that long ago that they could cap the lagoons and capture the methane and turn it into power. And with the help of Duke Energy, make more millions. So, where the company can make money, the company is willing to spend money, where unfortunately it's just hurting the environment and the people next door, they'd rather litigate. And one thing that was interesting about it, and Mona lived through this, but I would love it if there were many more of these cases that could come down the pike. But sadly, the industry went to the State House and got the law changed in midstream, and they've basically barred the courthouse door. Not quite, but it would take a really unique case to be able to get past the gauntlet that they set up for these cases in the future. They basically insulated agricultural operations from nuisance lawsuits. A 400-year-old tort says that, hey, you can't unreasonably interfere with your neighbor's use and enjoyment of their property. Apparently now in North Carolina for agricultural operations, that's no longer good law.
Well, I'm sorry to do this to you. Thank you for that brilliant answer. But you guys are so popular. I'm getting questions left and right. And I want to get to some of these questions if I can. Let me try to if I can go through them quickly. One of them I think you've touched on a little bit, but Rania Masri, a name I don't think I've heard since I was in graduate school at Duke. Says, thank you for your time and energy. Ms. Wallace, given the so-called anti-nuisance legislation in North Carolina and in other numerous agricultural states, do you think there's any room for litigation against the ongoing environmental injustices of hog and poultry farms within North Carolina?
It is, to me, beyond tragic that literally right before we were to go to trial, that our legislators passed a bill. They came within 2 votes of dismissing our lawsuits together. It was one of the biggest, I don't know what to say, showdowns in North Carolina legislative history. You couldn't even get into the legislative building. But the bill was to, one, get rid of our current lawsuits, the ones that we had filed years before and been litigating for years, and then to essentially get rid of the common law nuisance, which was the first tort in the 16th century in history. And they did pass that bill that said, essentially in common sense, it does away. It allows you to file a lawsuit, but you have to file it within a year. It limits you to rental income, and for just a very short time, that is valueless, essentially. So as to private nuisance, that is a problem. The environmentalists have continued, environmental groups, and we support them, and they were extremely supportive of us. River keepers, water keepers, Southern Environmental Law Center. There's still litigation ongoing, which they're trying to get the industry to make these changes. But for those listening, it was so disappointing with the legislators. It wasn't just that they changed the law. They passed an anti-gag bill, one of the most restrictive, that wouldn't allow any of the workers to share information with us. They passed other legislation making all the farm records private and no longer public, except for certain circumstances. So it was one bit of legislation after another, interfering with the access to the courts and the right to seek justice. That was so discouraging throughout. And I just thank the jurors that they did get their verdicts correct. They saw it, and that's why I wanted to show it to you. I don't think it's justified at all what they're continuing to do.
Thank you. Mayor Jennifer Roberts asks, Smithfield was supposed to use the latest technology for environmental protection in a settlement years ago, but they've not complied. Why have they not been held accountable? Josh Stein's office was engaging in this. Corban, anything on that?
I'm guessing that she's referring to the Smithfield agreement with the state attorney general in 2000. I mean, look, what happens in politics when you have an intractable social problem and you've got a bunch of people clamoring for change, and then on the other side, you've got a super profitable company with a lot of money going to politicians? Well, you study the problem. So instead of, actually having the AG go after Smithfield and say, no, you're despoiling the environment, you're harming our constituents, the AG set up a deal where Smithfield would fund a search for new technology to replace lagoons and spray fields. With $15 million, it became $25 million. And the idea was, look, the good scientists at NC State would study the issue, would come up with some technology. And if it turned out that the technology was both feasible for the farmers to implement and also would fundamentally take care of the problem of environmental, despoliation, and would also be economically wouldn't put the company out of business, economically feasible. Smithfield would actually be obligated under the agreement to implement the technology across the entire supply chain. Well, what did Smithfield do? So the good scientists at NC State found a technology that they called super soils, later Terra Blue, that did exactly what everyone expected that it would do. It was just a more civilized way of disposing of hog waste: separate the liquids and solids, recycle both, don't send any of it into the air or the rivers and streams. But with this technology, of course, it was going to cost some more than the legacy lagoons and spray fields, which are medieval technology. And so when it came time for the environmental subcommittee to sit down and decide, is this economically feasible? The industry had already packed that subcommittee with its own people. And so what they decided was, if it would cost Smithfield 1 cent more to implement this new technology, it's not economically feasible. So they were able to basically buy 12 years apiece, for a measly $25 million. And then they got sued. Thank God for Mona. I mean, really, like, had it not been for Wallace and Graham and Mike Keskey and these plaintiffs who were courageous enough to stand up and take their place in front of their communities, against intimidation and against all odds, the Smithfield Agreement never would have had a prayer of being enforced, even to the extent that it has been. What's ironic, though, is that that agreement is still live. I mean, the current Attorney General could turn around and, knock on Smithfield's door and say, hey, guys, guess what? I'm coming after you. You signed on the dotted line and you basically torpedoed the process in an unjust way. So maybe there'll be an Attorney General who will stand up to them again and say, let's revisit the Smithfield Agreement.
So I guess we need to talk to Mr. Stein about that. I want to jump down to this question here because I think it's a familiar name. Matt Leatherman says, these stories of water continue to unfold for these communities and Duplin, Pender, nearby counties, including disposal of chicken waste, chemical runoff from manufacturing facilities, decay of water sewer systems, and flooding from increasing extreme weather. What gives you hope for these communities' future, and what gives you concern? And what do you think folks in this session can do to be the best agents for change? If you can answer that that's not a softball question.
I don't mind taking that, and then
Yeah.
Corban come behind me. Voting. Who you vote for, your legislators, you need to ask them what's their opinion on this issue. And if they don't want to do something about the environment and to preserve it and equality and access to the courts and justice for all, then that's not a person you want to vote for. Secondly, groups like your group, the environmental groups. I saw a question where someone asked about the Humane Society in PETA. They've been very active, very concerned about the animals. This book, Corban, it was only after the 4th federal trial. I never spoke to the press. I would never be interviewed. We only told our story in the courthouse, but it became obvious after the 4th trial that unless the story was told, that there would never be change. And also, you need to make good choices in what food you choose to eat, and you need to know how it's raised, where it's raised, and who is trying to do the right thing by the environment. You ask about Eastern North Carolina and the chickens and the turkeys and the contaminated water and C8, and our firm is handling the Camp Lejeune cases, by the way. North Carolina has gotten, instead of better, it's worse, because now we are, I think, #1 in this country about chicken farms. And we have so many turkeys, and already you have the C8, you have Camp Lejeune. So there needs to be serious change looking at North Carolina. And really, the people just need to unite and to get that done. And this law, this lack of regulations in North Carolina, and this get out of jail free card for agriculture, that's why we're having more and more chicken and turkey farms. So, I'm very disappointed in the legislators who supported them.
Yeah.
I would add only one thing. That's a brilliant answer and just right on all the points. Cory Booker, the senator, the U.S. senator, has a bill, the Farm System Reform Act, that would go a long way to reforming this industry at the federal level. It's, of course, stuck in Congress. But one thing that is, potentially going forward is that every few years, Congress has to pass a new farm bill. And both parties, regardless of, what you think of the parties, both parties always sign on the dotted line when it comes to supporting America's farmers. The question is what goes into the new farm bill this year. And my understanding is that Senator Booker is pushing to add some pieces of his Farm Systems Reform Act to the new farm bill. So that is something that, those with a legislative mind and an interest in supporting a great measure can take a look at and see what you can do. I love Senator Booker. I mean, he actually was down in Eastern North Carolina himself, met Elsie Herring. She told me a story of meeting him, and he's really just a truly great individual. And I hope he's successful with this bill.
Amen. I hope so too. I want to ask this one last question. There's so many more questions. If you could stay around for another hour, I would keep you here because we still have questions. But this question comes from June Bolotnick. She asks about our former Department of Environmental Quality Secretary, Mike Regan, is now the EPA supervisor. He's been very much concerned over the years about the impact of environmental injustices on Black and Brown communities. Do you think that there's any chance that his position there might cause some sort of change in the bills on a federal level if we can't get change on the state level?
Corban, that I certainly would hope that he would step in. He was the whole environmental management group, the state, Diener, all of them were watching these trials. And in fact, one of the individuals who was responsible for the CAFOs and the conditions testified for the industry. I found that most of those that were part of the state, Diener, whatever, had been previously very close to industry. He now has that independence and that national prominence. And also, you didn't mention this, but Dr. Ron Barber, he was very supportive along with Cory Booker. I actually met with him, and he cares very strongly about this issue. So it is racial injustice, it's environmental injustice, it's inequality. I think it hits so many issues that today in this world we're talking about. I'm hopeful someone will stand up and take a stand nationally.
Did you mean William Barber?
William Barber, yes. I'm so
Yes, yes,
sorry.
yes.
Yes, William Barber.
No, no.
I'm sorry. Yes.
And he's from that part of the state, lives in that
He
part of the
is.
state even now. So yes, he's very much concerned about this issue. Corban?
Oh, no, I didn't have anything to add.
Okay. Well, I have to say, thank you all very much for a rich and just an incredible conversation. This hour has been filled with learnings, with stories, with just the beginning of a deeper conversation. I think that we need to figure out how do we deal with these modes of injustice that are continually impacting people, particularly those who are most vulnerable in our society. I want to thank you again for, Mona, championing these people who have had no voice, who tried to speak for so long, but no one would listen. And you got people to listen. You found a brilliant strategy to make them listen. And Corban, thank you so much for telling the stories that people did not know they needed to hear. But once they hear them, they're quite inspired to do something about it. Grateful to you both for your continued work. And I'm just going to say, would love to have you come back for a full-fledged hearing where we get to dig deep into these issues and bring some witnesses with you that can testify as to what life is like living in these contexts. Grateful for you all for joining us tonight. And thank you for just spending this time with us. We've heard that there are things that we can do. Please contact your local congresspeople. Please contact people like Cory Booker. Please contact people like Mike Regan. And let's begin to continue to push this larger issue. Getting in touch with PETA, getting in touch with groups that are involved with looking at this problem from a different angle. And always remember the racial justice dimensions of this concern as well. I know that I'm going to go back to the Department of Environmental Quality's Environmental Justice Committee and say, this is something that we need to look at for the disparate impact on Black, Brown, and Indigenous people that live in these particular regions. Grateful for all that you will have given us tonight. And before we go, just let me tell you, this has been one of the wonderful programs of the Reimagining America Project. If you are interested, we meet every week from 5 to 6:30 on Wednesday to really delve into these issues, to learn about strategies that we can address racial disparity in America. We believe that race is a problem. Race is, unfortunately, though, a made-up concept, has very real impacts. And until we're able to address those real impacts, we're going to see the kinds of unequal living situations that we see in our society today. We need champions. We need people like Mona. We need people like Corban that will do this kind of hard work that can begin to turn the tide and change the systems that perpetuate these modes of injustice. As we go, let's look to the Lord to be dismissed. God, you are amazing. You provide those who will work for change, even when change seems impossible. All those who are here tonight who believe that there can be a better way, we want to ask that you continue to inspire them, encourage their hearts, let them know that nothing is impossible, that we believe in a higher force, a higher being, a higher sense of justice, and we can manifest a different vision if we so believe. As we come before you, we ask that you would not let us sleep easily, but be constantly aware of the work that must be done, that your kingdom come, that your will would be done, that all your people made in your image would be treated equally. We call on you by many names, but in all of them, we just want to say, thank you and use us. Amen. God bless you all and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.